Hi there. The UN Climate Change Conference began on the 3rd this month with a warning that as the greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change could lead to the collapse of civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world. Almost 200 countries and regions are meeting in Poland for 2 weeks, aiming to hammer out a vital agreement to turn the carbon-cutting vision set in Paris in 2015 into reality. So where do things stand now? How far are we behind the targets set in Paris? And how will we be able to leave a safe and clean world for future generations? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very glad to be joined in the Beijing studio by Wu Changhua, Executive Director of the Professional Association for China's Environment, and Professor Qi Ye, Director of the Brookings Institution Tsinghua Center for Public Policy. We shall also speak via satellite to Isabel Hilton, CEO of China Dialogue, who's in London. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Changhua, what can we expect from this climate change conference?
3 specific things. One, I think this rule book of Paris Agreement needs to be agreed upon this time in Poland negotiation. Secondly, we need to figure out where the money is because developed countries back in 2009 and then of course again in 2015 have committed this $100 billion annually by 2020. And we know there is a big gap between what's committed and the reality. So we need to figure out where the money is and how to bridge the gap. And thirdly, I think the global community needs to lift up further their level of ambition. If you look at what's included in the current Paris Agreement, countries have committed to, when you add up, they just do not meet the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees target. So hopefully through the negotiation process, countries will be able to lift up further their level of obligation so that we'll be able to really meet the challenge.
Almost from day one, Qi Ye, of the UN Conference on Climate Change, we've had enough diversified voices, conflicting messages coming out of the conference delegations this time around from over 190 countries. Is it likely that we're going to reach a consensus?
I think a lot of consensus have been reached so far. Right now, the most important thing is to implement this consensus. But there are a lot of issues, very important issues that are still very hard to reach consensus, as Changhua just mentioned. Finance, very big problem. The good news is the World Bank is increasing that to $200 billion. That's very good news. But still, there are a lot of major differences. Leading up to this conference, COP24, and we have seen the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, release the 1.5C report. That can, on the one hand, really help us to think about the urgency. On the other hand, probably that also creates some new differences in terms of the views from different countries and different organizations over the urgency and also responses to this. I think it is not surprising to see all these differences. But this is a place to express the differences and also to resolve the differences for solutions.
Let me cross over to Isabel. The 2 panelists in Beijing are addressing the issue of differences, consensus, and the major issues, or especially targets on the agenda of this conference in Poland. But do you expect to have breakthroughs? And what, if you can, how would you look at the issue of execution?
I think you'd have to be fairly optimistic to expect a breakthrough at this point. I mean, if you think back to Paris and what the conditions were that allowed nearly 200 countries to come to that moment of agreement in Paris, there were a number of enabling conditions, including a great deal of very hard work behind the scenes by the French diplomatic corps, who were constantly on the job in making sure that small disputes didn't become major crises. It was very impressive. The second important context was the agreement between the United States and China that they would work together towards the Paris Agreement. And unfortunately, those enabling conditions no longer apply, and so much has changed since 2016 that the background political impetus is much weaker than it was. So if you look around the world, you see the European Union in all manner of crisis. Here in Britain, all the political oxygen is being sucked up by Brexit. And you have President Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil, you have a dissenter in Australia. So it's a much more fragmented scenario in terms of political will, and that really does affect what happens in the negotiations. The other thing is that whilst all these countries have one large common interest, which is fighting climate change, when it comes down to the detail of who does what and who pays, which is always what these arguments are about, of course their interests fragment, and in the negotiations, the negotiators each try to defend their country's narrow interests within the context of the larger goal. So we've arrived in Paris with more than 250 pages of disputed text to resolve in 2 weeks, and that's going to be pretty challenging, I think.
Isabel, you spoke of the enabling conditions that have unfortunately disappeared. One of them is, of course, the attitude and policy option of Washington. The U.S. made the decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord last year, which caused great controversy. President Trump says that China has very bad air that is coming over to the United States. So what do you think of this blame game? Will that cause very strong repercussions the world over? Isabel?
Well, the blame game is completely unhelpful in this context. But I'd say two things about the position of the United States. One is that despite the announcement of withdrawal, the United States is still in the negotiations, and that's not actually terribly helpful at this point. But if you look past the federal government in the United States, what you see is a huge amount of action at state level. There's a coalition called We Are Still In. You know, there's an enormous amount of effort going on in the United States despite President Trump. Of course, when it comes to the international negotiations, the attitude of the federal government is pretty dire, and there's a great deal of misrepresentation, as we know, for example, of the position of China by President Trump. So that's not helpful. What other countries have to decide, and I think pretty much are resolved on, is that regardless of President Trump's position, it nevertheless is in everybody's interest to continue this effort to fight climate change, because nobody gains by abandoning it. This is not a zero-sum game, and it shouldn't be treated as such.
No, it's
but
not
it is
a zero-sum
discouraging,
game, Isabel. Thank you so much. President Trump is not alone. The newly elected Brazilian President, Jair Bolsonaro, is also joining him in holding a defiant attitude towards getting rid of fossil fuel. What do you make of the discrepancies that come from within the BRICS?
It's discouraging, as Isabel mentioned, and ideally, you know, because we're all in this together, the global, you know, tackling climate change requires global efforts, global consensus, but somehow the world is becoming more fragmented. And, you know, the new Brazilian president's opinion or statement doesn't really help that much at all. And somehow, hopefully, he hasn't really stated that clearly yet to say that Brazil will withdraw from Paris Agreement, hopefully not. It's also sort of discouraging in a way in the BRICS context there. Large developing countries, emerging economies, at this moment really need to work with each other, and particularly around the climate change issues. It's not just for the sake of the climate change issue itself, but also actually this is an opportunity for large economies to really think hard about how to take advantage of the technology progress, technology revolution, and redefine and reshape their economy industries. So in the process actually of rapid development of the large economies, rather than following the old track, so that they will be able to figure out an alternative model actually of development. So as I said, I do not appreciate that. I don't think the rest of the world will really appreciate the Brazilian president's statement like that. Hopefully he will wake up and really stay in the pact and continue to take action.
I'm wondering aloud if President Trump and his Brazilian counterpart are the Holy Alliance. I very much appreciate what Isabel said a couple of minutes back about the local level in the United States. It seems, other than the attitudes of the federal government, the local authorities in the United States deserve credit for taking a lot of action. Do you think that's the silver lining, if not the silver bullet?
I don't really think so. I think nothing can actually replace the national government, in this case the federal government. And it is very helpful to have the states and the cities and the local governments and the NGOs and enterprises in this game. So they are still in, but as a nation, they are out. Then hopefully, you know, sometime in the future, the United States can return to this game. But without the federal effort, without commitment from the federal government, I think the things will be very, very different. Taking the finance, for example, this is you can only rely on the federal government to have the committed the responsibilities for the finance and many other issues. So I think, you know, we should not now. We have been talking about this for more than a year about the local governments. But I think we really need to look forward to beyond this, and we cannot really just make ourselves comfortable on that. Right?
Isabel, let me go back to the issue of financing. It seems member states or parties who signed the climate change agreement in Paris 3 years ago fell short of the expectations of the general public in raising the fund. So do you think this is an issue of domestic politics? I mean, taxpayers in the individual countries of the member states refuse to pay, and therefore politicians in their electoral politics would have to take into consideration the concerns of their constituents.
I think you're right about that. I mean, we are all still suffering the after effects of the global financial crisis, and electorates, you know, in Europe and in the United States are certainly feeling worse off, and this is in part because there's been, you know, a tremendous growth in the gap between the incomes of ordinary people and the incomes of the extremely well off. But of course then in electoral politics that doesn't help at all. And as long as people are suffering austerity, they're suffering cuts to services, it's quite hard to persuade them that for what seems to them a long-term problem, large sums of money should be transferred to developing countries. On the other hand, if you are a developing country and you're being asked to embrace this energy transition, there is certainly a marginal cost, and it's very difficult for them to plan without upfront commitment. So part of the argument is about the sums of money and the delivery of the sums of money, but the other half of it is the commitment in advance by developed countries so that developing countries know what they've got to work with, and neither of those is in a satisfactory state at present.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Changhua, where do we stand? I'm talking about China, in inventing and applying green technologies to sustain the low-carbon development in China?
That's probably one of the brightest spots at this moment in the world. If you look around the world, particularly look at the energy transition, China has played a very significant role in terms of leadership. If you look at the investment in renewable energy, if you look at the investment in energy efficiency, products and the services there, China definitely has been doing, performing greatly. We could say it's still not enough, we could do more, but so far China has definitely done a lot. Ideally, this is more a domestic effort. So China is also more and more stepping up its leadership at the global level. And when China works with the rest of the world, I hope that China will really also keep this in mind, So whatever the transfer technologies or investment in overseas projects, infrastructure, technologies, industries, we also need to honor the climate change challenges, the commitment there as well, because we all know you do not want to end up with this sort of investment today, but somehow locked in there for decades to come. And that's going to cause major sort of high carbon economy or infrastructure for the rest of the world. So that's a sort of reminder of Chinese decision makers to say, on one side, China definitely has been doing great and really speed up. We need to accelerate the actions because in many, many cases, we're proving the technologies, the business models, whatever, the deployment, that the effectiveness actually of low carbon technology. But on the other hand, actually China does need to keep in mind it also has a responsibility when its capital going global.
Achievements and progress are always regarded as history, if not catalyst for greater expectations. China remains the biggest manufacturing center for the whole world at the cost of the environment, and that's perhaps one of the major reasons why President Xi Jinping elevates the issue of ecological security to the level of national security, among all others, such as financial risks and poverty relief. So what do you think of the impact of approving the Environment Act? Previously, no Chinese took environmental protection or illegal acts in this area very seriously. But ever since President Xi Jinping taking office, he vowed to have a clean sky, a blue sky, clean environment, and to live in an environmentally friendly country to the generations to come. So what do you think of the execution and the vision of the Chinese leadership?
I think the leadership, the policy, and implementation has been amazing the last five and a half years, especially since September 2013, when there was the air pollution control and prevention action plan, and following that, the water pollution, and following that, the soil pollution. I think over the last 5 years, the policy and implementation has been really amazing. This also helped the climate change effort here in China. But the problem is, as is always the case, how you balance the economic growth and the employment and also the environmental protection. As we've seen here this year here in Beijing and many other places in the region, that in November, the air quality PM 2.5 has been worsening as compared to last year. It's 50% more than last year. So that has to do with when you're implementing this very stringent standard on air pollution, then that does impact the economy. I think this domestic case can also apply to the world global environment, as we have seen in Paris. So what I see, the president in Brazil, president in the United States, we should not really take them as individuals. They do represent this very big part of the population who have this pursuit for their living standard.
Yes, indeed, the vision of the leadership does matter. Let me cross over to Isabel. Let's take a look at the broad picture concerning, for example, despite the Doctrine crisis that occurred last year, the Indian government says over and over that it welcomes the Chinese investment in building infrastructure and many other areas. Having said that, you might view this as the extension of the Maoist legacy concerning our friendship with Africa, particularly the Sub-Saharan region, but the Chinese government and Mr. Xi Jinping promised to assist with the process of industrialization in Africa. You put these things together into one perspective of further industrialization. Will that add to the problem of greenhouse gas emissions and global warming?
Well, I think it very much depends on how it's done, and I absolutely agree with Chahua when she talks about China's international responsibilities. The Belt and Road Initiative will involve 70 countries, perhaps. If those 70 countries adopt the Chinese model of development, or at least the model of development that China had until eco-civilization, then there is absolutely no chance of meeting the Paris goals or getting anywhere near them. So China is in a tremendously powerful position as, you know, one of the biggest global investors and now development actors to determine which model of development is adopted. And I think that it would be very encouraging if China, for example, would commit to not building any new coal. At present, China is still building coal-fired power stations outside China, and China's coal use inside China has sadly not quite peaked. So there are still opportunities here for a transformation, and China can lead by example in terms of its own domestic transformation, but it can also ensure that its investments abroad and the model of industrialization that it encourages its partner countries to adopt is truly sustainable. You know, there isn't really much point in having short-term growth if the longer-term consequences are climate catastrophe. This is not development. And at this point, we're really very clear about what the consequences are of the wrong model of growth. So China has a huge opportunity here, and it would be tremendously encouraging, I think, for this whole climate effort if China were truly to embrace that.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And our friend in Nepal, the neighboring country in South Asia, they do have good reasons to show serious concerns about the melting of glacier and the snow-capped mountains of the Himalaya, Mount Everest, so to speak. Now, having said this, Isabel put her finger on the issue of coal burning, the fossil fuel burning. That has caused a lot of rioting in Paris recently. Now, we've been talking about climate change and environmental decline for so many years, Chang Hua and Professor Qi Ye. One of the issues is that China used to depend on coal burning for up to 70, if not 80% of the power generation. Is that still the case?
No, we are much down now.
Much down.
We're at a 60-ish actually percent now. So that's one of the milestones actually China has achieved so far in terms of decarbonizing the energy infrastructure. In the meantime, even though actually in coal-fired power plants, China has started to implement probably the most restrictive standards in terms of emissions there. And something called extreme or super low emissions technologies are now being adopted at current coal-fired power plants in China. So that definitely will help, but somehow it doesn't really totally solve the problem. Meaning, when you burn coal, you do emit greenhouse gases emissions, and that's contributed to the worsening of the climate change challenges globally. So China needs to be aware of that. And you mentioned about the consequences in terms of glacier melting, particularly if the third pole, Himalaya, the plateau is called the third pole of the world, besides Antarctica and Arctic. And if you look at the melting, the speed, the pace of melting of the region, it's horrifying.
And former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, won a Nobel Peace Prize for producing a documentary about the global warming. And he deserves credit for waking up people about this serious problem.
Absolutely. I think probably it's also time to bring back that sort of message again. Of course, particularly in the last few months, there's some new researches or studies and reports coming out, like IPCC special report, 1.5 degrees Celsius, as Professor Qi mentioned earlier on, that really sort of reinforcing the message, the sense of urgency. We literally today we're living in crisis already. If you look at the forest fires in California, if you like typhoons, hurricanes around the world, literally all year round, it has already become the norm of the day. Meaning we literally live in the crisis or consequences of climate change. It is time really urgently to take action.
To say nothing of the pervasive pollution of the oceans by plastic garbage, the industrial wastes that we dump endlessly into the open oceans. Having said this, what do you think of, say, the negative impact of heavy smog on the city of Beijing and indeed in many other parts of China after we enter into the winter? Do you think it's the seasonal factor that delivers so many grave problems like the choking pollution of the air?
I think you do need the weather to cooperate like we had in the last year, and but at the same time,
it seems that APEC Blue has become a luxury for most of the Chinese.
That's right, especially as we mentioned last month, and we have seen the concentration PM 2.5 has increased by 54%. That's the major increase. And the analysis shows that that has to do with the just relaxing the standard for implementation this year, and in areas surrounding Beijing and Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei area, and because we have also need to balance the economic growth and employment and other social issues. So you just mentioned the plastic pollution in the ocean. So we are not just facing the climate change challenges, we are also facing other challenges, poverty alleviation here in China and many other developing countries. I think that's really the challenge we are facing nowadays. On the one hand, we need to accelerate our action on climate change, and we need to decarbonize the entire world economy by 2050 in order to achieve the target below 1.5 C. At the same time, that seems to be scientifically said, it seems to be very, very difficult targets to reach. So we are now right in between a rock and a hard place. Is no matter what you do, you will find people to support, people to oppose you. Right?
Very quickly, I'd like to have your comments from both of you about the recent truce that President Xi Jinping and his American counterpart called on the sidelines of the G20 in Argentina to postpone the imposition of tariffs on so many Chinese items that we export to the United States. Soybean is one of them, of course, a major one. The other is the increase in our imports of American gas and energy. Do you think that will help increase the use of our clean energy? Will that help reduce our reliance on fossil fuel, despite the rioting in Paris and the tax issue President Macron imposed? But he's going to call a truce.
I think partly yes. The answer is short-term yes. And comparatively speaking, natural gas is a cleaner fossil fuels compared to coal and petroleum. And so if somehow within a very short period of time we increase the use of natural gas, in power generation, in real life energy system there, I think we will be able to see the outcome, the changes there. But in the meantime, we need to understand, the context there. As I said, this is the sort of, you call it truce actually because of trade war, right? So there's a lot of complicated matters or reasons or factors in it. This is between the two largest economies, and because they have this trade war, they need to figure out how to, relax the situation, trying to figure out the way forward. I have to say, there's still a lot of uncertainty in that actually at this moment.
Uncertainties aside, I wouldn't expect you to conclude the trade war between the two big economies, but what do you think of the silver lining concerning the use of or imports of green technology and green energy from the United States during this period of truce?
I don't really see a great prospect for importing green technology from the United States, because under this the so-called truce, right now, and China has promised to buy a lot of more natural gas, LNG, and oil products from the United States. I think LNG is very interesting. Over the last 1.5 decades, the world has experienced accelerated transition of decarbonization. Natural gas, LNG played a very, very important role, and we look into the future, the natural gas will continue to play a very, very important role. And here in China, natural gas is becoming a mainstream fuel. And I think this also relates to Qatar's retreat from OPEC, because the natural gas is really playing very, very big role. But that can only be a bridge fuel. In the end, we have to rely on green technology, green energy in order to achieve that decarbonization.
Thank you so much, Chen Hua and Qi Ye. Despite the enormous campaign, or what is called the China bashing crusade by both parties, the Republicans, Democrats in the D.C., to delink the Chinese economy or to facilitate the process of deglobalization, there are at least two things that can tie up the two economies. One is soybean, the other is perhaps energy cooperation. I will see you next time. Goodbye.